Today, guys, on Beer Geek Nation, I wanted to cover a topic that I find a little bit of interest in. I know a lot of you guys will. Dry yeast versus liquid yeast. You know, what do I use? What are the pros and cons of each? And what ultimately do I recommend to you guys? Well, let's get right into it. Let's talk about liquid yeast first. Some of the pros. I think there's one really big pro with liquid yeast. There's hundreds of varieties of liquid yeast. If you're brewing a style of beer where the yeast actually imparts flavor to that beer, you know, a nuance to that beer, then you're going to absolutely want to use a liquid yeast. And by that, I mean, you know, a German Hefeweizen or a Belgian Witbier, something like that, where the yeast plays an important role in the actual flavor of the beer. You're going to want to use a liquid yeast pack. You just can't get those subtle kind of nuances out of a dry yeast, and there aren't the number of varieties as the liquid yeast. So that's really the one big key to liquid yeast. It's got so many varieties, and they do impart so much flavor into the beers. What are the cons of liquid yeast? Well, again, I think there's a big one on this one too: the price. They're literally 2 to 3 times the cost of a dry pack. So that definitely weighs into, you know, if you're brewing a certain type of beer, how much more cost is going to be added into the yeast. Their cell count tends to be a little bit lower in the liquid yeast as well. They say about 100 billion cells, but after shipping or if they're not stored properly, that cell count is definitely going to go down. So with a lower cell count, you're going to have to use a yeast starter, which isn't a bad thing at all, but it is an additional step, and it is a little bit extra cost into the price of the beer. So liquid yeast, if you're brewing to a perfect style that imparts flavors from the yeast, you're going to absolutely want to use it, but be aware it is going to cost you a little bit more money. Now, dry yeast, and when I talk about dry yeast, I'm talking about Safe Ale, Nottingham, Danstar, those little packages of yeast. What's the big pros on dry yeast? Well, the low cost. You know, if liquid yeast is expensive, the dry yeast is much, much cheaper. So you can buy more of them. They tend to have higher cell counts because they don't have to, they're not as temperamental about storage and shipping and everything. You do still want to keep them cold. You want to make sure it's stored cold, but not nearly as important as the liquid yeast. No starter needed. They already have a yeast nutrient in the actual packs, so you don't want to use that nutrient up in a starter. You want to save it for the beer. Higher cell count, no starter, lower price, and they tend to be very clean finishing strains. I mean, you know, they don't impart a lot of flavor, just kind of do their job, get out, and, you know, just drop out, and it doesn't really do anything except produce, you know, the alcohol in the beer and just clean up the beer, which is what, you know, if you're doing a pale ale or something, is perfect for. Get the yeast, have it go in there, do its job, and get out. So what are the cons of dry yeast? Well, there's a big one, another big one. Lack of variety. You know, there's not nearly the amount of varieties of dry yeast as there are the liquid yeast, but it is getting better. Basically, why is that? Well, that's the dehydration process that occurs creating dry yeast. They remove 90% of the moisture content, of the water content of the yeast. A lot of the different liquid yeast strains can't tolerate that. They just don't survive, and they just, you know, a lot of the strain, like the Hefeweizen strain or, you know, a Belgian strain, might not be able to tolerate that dehydration process, which is why there are less strains of dry yeast cells. And that is a big, you know, that's kind of a big con. So at the end of the day, liquid yeast and dry yeast both have their pros, they both have their cons. What do I recommend? You know, after reading a whole lot of this, well, personally, when I brew a pale ale, an IPA, even like an amber ale, just something very simple where I don't need a yeast characteristic, I say absolutely. I use US-05, Safe Ale US-05, basically exclusively. I have used US-04, which I believe is the English strain, and a couple brown ales as well. They just work great. They're super quick, they're super efficient, and again, they're just clean finishing yeast. And I think if you're doing that, a pale ale, IPA, double IPA, go ahead and use the dry yeast. It's not going to hurt anything. It's going to save you a couple bucks, and you can just pitch a couple packs in there to make sure you have the right pitching rate as well. When do I use liquid yeast? Well, like I said, if I'm doing Belgian beer, I brew a lot of Belgian beers. I use a lot of liquid yeast in the Belgian beers. I love the Chimay strain. I forget the number off the top of my head, the Wyeast Chimay strain. The high gravity Trappist strain is one of my favorites. They have a lot of great liquid Saison strains that I use. I like the French Saison strain. I think it's a great one. So if I'm brewing a Belgian beer, which I tend to brew a lot of, I'll definitely do a yeast starter. I'll definitely use a liquid yeast. But again, if you're brewing a beer where the yeast is going to impart flavor, you're going to want to use a liquid yeast. Don't cheap out on it. It's such an important part of different styles of beers. So ultimately, in the end, what do you want your beer to say? You know, if you're brewing a style that needs it, don't cheap out, use liquid. If you're brewing a simple American ale that doesn't require a lot of yeast flavors, just use dry. Don't worry about it. You know, and the other thing I get asked a lot is, can you harvest dry yeast? Absolutely. I've harvested US-05. You know, it's almost overkill because it is so cheap, but I have harvested it. You got to remember, these dry strains come from liquid strains anyways. Usually very, very strong liquid strains, like US-05 is the Chico strain, which is the Sierra Nevada strain. So just awesome stuff. I mean, you can't go wrong. The production of yeast has gotten so good with the different technology they use to develop these yeast in labs now, that it's just, you can't go wrong either way. Previously, dry yeast used to be considered unpure strains. That's just not the case anymore. They're always 100% pure strains at this point. So what do you guys think? You know, do you use liquid or dry yeast, or was I completely off on this one? Just comment below. Let me know what you guys think. And remember, folks, life's too short. Drink amazing beers. Cheers.